She said, "I'll marry anyone who saves me." Then he appeared, the sheriff. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The town of Dry Creek sat still under the punishing Arizona sun. Its main street, a strip of packed dust bordered by leaning wooden buildings. It was a place where law came thin, carried more by reputation than written rules, and fear often silenced the decent before they could act. That afternoon, the town had gathered for all the wrong reasons. In the middle of the street, on her knees, was a young woman. Her name was Clara Hayes, 25, the daughter of a small rancher who had died the year before, leaving her to drift between odd jobs in nearby towns. She had come to Dry Creek a week earlier, looking for work as a seamstress or cook, but the town had offered little. Her last dollar had gone to food 3 days ago. When the outlaw grabbed her outside the saloon, no one stepped in. Now she knelt in the dirt, dress torn open at the chest from where he had dragged her, her breath short, her arms trembling as she tried to cover herself and keep from collapsing entirely. The outlaw's name wasn't known to most in town, just another drifter with liquor on his breath and violence in his eyes. He pressed his revolver against Clara's temple with a drunkard's grin, shouting at the crowd, "Ain't none of you got the guts to stop me." His words carried, and the crowd lowered their eyes. Mothers pulled children inside. Men who had rifles leaned on them but didn't move. Clara's heart pounded so hard she thought she might faint, her throat dry as ash. She whispered, barely aware. The words slipped past her lips. "I'll marry anyone who saves me, anyone." It wasn't a promise of love. It was desperation, her last effort to make someone care enough to step forward. At the far end of the street, boots struck the dust in a steady rhythm. Sheriff Daniel Cade emerged from the shadow of the livery stable. He was 33, a tall man with broad shoulders and a revolver tied low on his hip. The war had left him with scars and years of silence, and burying his wife 2 winters back had taken whatever remained of his softness. He was in Dry Creek for glory. His duty was simple: keep order, keep people breathing, and keep worse men from overrunning the town. That mission weighed heavier than any badge pinned to his chest. Daniel's eyes fixed on Clara as he walked forward, slow and deliberate. He could see the bruises already forming on her arms, the panic in her gaze, the way her lips trembled as she tried to stay upright. He didn't let his hand twitch toward his gun too soon, didn't want to spook the outlaw into firing. Inside, his stomach turned at the sight. He had seen enough war to know what terror did to a person, but seeing it on a civilian, a young woman with nothing to defend herself, brought a heat to his chest he hadn't felt in a long time. The outlaw barked a laugh, waving his pistol in Daniel's direction while keeping it pressed against Clara's head. "Back off, Sheriff, she's mine today. You hear me, M." Daniel's jaw tightened, his hand resting lightly on the worn grip of his revolver. He didn't raise his voice, he never did. Let her go. The silence stretched, heavy as the heat. Clara's thoughts ran wild. Would he shoot her? Would the sheriff fire too late? She felt her knees weakening, her body giving way under the pressure of the gun barrel. A cold certainty spread through her chest that this might be the last moment she drew breath. Daniel made his choice in less than a second. His revolver cleared leather in a blur, the crack of the shot splitting the stillness of Dry Creek. Smoke curled from the barrel. The outlaw fell face first into the dirt, gun tumbling from his hand. The crowd gasped, then quickly broke apart, scurrying back into buildings as if they hadn't been watching all along. Clara's arms gave out, her knees sinking fully into the dust, her whole body shaking uncontrollably. Daniel holstered his weapon in one practice motion, then stepped forward and caught her before she collapsed. She felt the strength in his grip steady and certain, the smell of gunpowder still clinging to him. Her breath came shallow, her eyes darting wildly before locking on his for the first time since she'd been dragged into the street. She felt the faintest flicker of safety. "Easy," he said, his voice calm but heavy with authority. "You're safe now." Clara let herself lean into him, unable to form words, her body trembling against his chest. For Daniel, the mission hadn't changed: protect the town, protect the innocent. But as he lifted her from the dirt and turned toward the edge of the street, he felt something new stirring. Something that had nothing to do with law or duty. And so, Sheriff Daniel Cade carried Clara Hayes away from the silence of the crowd and into the uncertain quiet of what would come next. Daniel carried Clara through the street without looking back. The townsfolk who had stood frozen only minutes earlier now slipped behind doors and shutters, pretending they had seen nothing. He felt their silence burning on his back, the same silence that had let a woman kneel in the dirt with a gun to her head. Clara clung weakly to his shirt, her breath uneven, her eyes half shut, as if each step he took might shake her apart. She was lighter than he expected, her body weakened, not just from the standoff, but from days of strain that no one in town had care to notice. At the edge of town, Daniel reached his horse tethered near the livery. He set her carefully in the saddle, steadying her so she wouldn't fall. Her hand tried to grip the horn but shook too much, so he climbed up behind her, one arm firm around her waist. As they rode out, she let out a sharp breath, the motion of the horse jarring the bruises across her ribs. He tightened his hold, lowering his voice near her ear. Almost there, his cabin was a mile out, far enough to keep her from the stairs, close enough to reach before her strength gave out. Inside Clara's mind, questions pressed hard. Why had the sheriff stepped in when no one else had moved? What made him different? Was he doing this only because it was his job? Or because he felt something else, some human pull that the others had ignored? Her shame still burned from the way her dress hung torn, from the way she had whispered that desperate promise in front of strangers. Would he think less of her for those words? She wanted to explain, to say she hadn't meant marriage, only survival. But her throat closed before any words could rise. Daniel's thoughts churned with their own weight. He hadn't planned to involve himself so personally. Lawmen kept order. They didn't carry women away from crowds, as though she were theirs to protect alone. But when he saw her eyes, when he heard the tremor in her voice, something had shifted inside him. He remembered burying his wife 2 winters ago, remembered the empty nights since, and realized he couldn't watch another woman left to fend for herself. His mission was law, but law without mercy was hollow. He told himself it was duty, yet the way his arms stayed firm around her waist told another truth. By the time they reached his cabin, Clara was nearly asleep against him, her exhaustion pulling her under. He lifted her down, carried her across the threshold, and laid gently on the bed he rarely used since his wife's death. The cabin was plain but clean, a stone hearth, a scarred table, shelves with tools, and a single photograph of a woman who no longer lived. Clara's eyes caught the photograph before she drifted into restless sleep, wondering who the woman was, wondering what kind of man she had just fallen into the care of. As Daniel watched her breathing steady at last, he realized he hadn't asked her name. He knew nothing about where she came from, what family she had, or why she had been in Dry Creek at all. The townsfolk hadn't said a word. That silence gnawed at him. Why had no one stepped in? What had she endured before this day that drove her to whisper such desperate words. He pulled a blanket over her shoulders and sat down by the fire, revolver on the table, determined to keep watch through the night. Clara stirred in her sleep, murmuring words too soft to catch, her face tightening as if nightmares chased her. Daniel stayed still, listening to the wind outside and the creak of the wooden beams. He didn't know her story yet, but he would. And for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel empty. It felt heavy with something new. Responsibility, yes, but also the first trace of belonging that neither of them had expected. Morning crept into the cabin through narrow gaps in the shutters, pale light falling across the floorboards. Daniel was already awake. He hadn't slept, not really. He sat at the table, revolver close by, a pot of coffee cooling on the stove. His eyes kept drifting back to the bed where Clara lay. She stirred often, her face drawn tight with nightmares, her lips moving with words he couldn't quite catch. He wondered what she had endured before the outlaw dragged her into the street, and why the town had turned its back so quickly. These questions pressed hard in his mind, because law, without answers, left gaps where trouble always found a way in. Clara woke with a start, her breath sharp as if she expected the outlaw's gun still pressed against her. When she realized where she was, her body went still, her gaze flicking to the sheriff who sat only a few feet away. Her hand clutched at the torn neckline of her dress, pulling it higher as shame ran through her. She spoke at last, her voice. Why did you help me? No one else even moved. Daniel met her eyes, his own steady, though the weight behind them was plain. Because I couldn't stand by. He didn't add more. Didn't tell her how seeing her had dragged up memories of battlefields, where he had once watched men die, while others froze. He didn't tell her about the wife he'd buried, or how silence had filled every night since. That part of himself stayed locked behind the wall he always carried. Clara swallowed hard, her thoughts restless. She wondered if he had risked himself only because it was his duty, or if something more had guided his hand. She wanted to thank him, but the words caught. Gratitude felt too small for what had just happened. Instead, she whispered, Clara, my name is Clara Hayes. It felt important to give him that, as though speaking her name aloud, reclaimed a piece of her dignity that had been stolen. Daniel nodded once, taking in the name with quiet respect. Daniel Cade, he said simply. He didn't say sheriff or announce his position. Titles meant less than action, and she already knew who he was. Her stomach growled softly, a sound that embarrassed her. But Daniel stood without comment, poured her coffee, and set a small plate of bread on the table. Eat, he said. His voice carried no judgment, only quiet insistence. She hesitated, then obeyed, her hands trembling as she tore the bread. The warmth of the coffee burned her throat, but steadied her all the same. After a long silence, she asked the question that had lingered since the night before. The picture by the bed. Who was she? She spoke carefully, worried she might have overstepped, but the curiosity pressed too strong. Daniel's hand tightened briefly on the coffee mug, and for a moment he considered not answering, but her eyes waited, honest and searching, and he gave her the truth. My wife, 2 years gone. He didn't say how she had died, only let the facts stand between them. Clara lowered her eyes, guilt cutting through her for intruding on his grief. Yet knowing he carried his own loss eased something in her chest. He wasn't a man untouched by sorrow, and that made his kindness toward her feel, not born of pity. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Daniel stood and moved to check them, his movements sharp and practiced. Town will be talking, he muttered. They already were yesterday. He didn't need to explain. Clara had seen the way people looked at her. A woman dragged in the dirt was never just a victim in their eyes. Whispers would spread, claimed she had brought trouble on herself, that the sheriff had taken her in for reasons unfit to speak. Fear pressed at her chest again. Will they come for me? Will they try to send me away? Her voice cracked under the weight of the thought. Daniel turned, his expression hardening into something that carried more weight than promises. No one will touch you here. It was the kind of vow that didn't need ceremony. She believed it because of the way his hand rested unconsciously near his revolver, and because he had already proven it in the street. Clara felt something stir inside her, a fragile thread of safety. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, she wasn't waiting for the next blow. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself and breathed slow, letting the fire's warmth sink into her bones. Daniel sat back down, his silence steady but not cold. He didn't press her for details about her past, though he wanted to. He figured the time would come when she would tell him what had brought her to Dry Creek, why no one had stepped in, why she had been so alone. For now, survival was enough. She was alive under his roof, and that was the only truth that mattered. The day passed slowly, measured by the crack of firewood and the sound of Clara's footsteps moving cautiously across the cabin floor. She wore one of Daniel's spare shirts now, long enough to cover her knees. Its sleeves rolled clumsily above her elbows. Her torn dress lay folded in a corner, unwearable until she could repair it. She busied herself with small tasks, sweeping dust from the floorboards, tidying the table, but every movement carried the stiffness of someone unsure if they were truly welcome. Daniel noticed it, though he said little. He had seen that kind of hesitation before in soldiers fresh from battle, unsure where safety ended and danger began. He understood, and so he gave her space. Still, he kept watch, his eyes following when she flinched at the creak of the cabin door, or when she startled at the echo of hoof beats on the road outside. By midday, Clara finally spoke the question that had sat in her chest since he carried her from a street. Why did no one else help me? Her voice was quiet, but it carried. She needed an answer because the silence of the crowd weighed heavier than the outlaw's gun had. Daniel sat down the piece of tack he was repairing and looked at her, his expression steady. Fear, he said. Men convince themselves it's safer not to step in. Safer to look the other way. They'll tell themselves it wasn't their fight, or it was none of their business. Truth is, they didn't want the risk. His words were blunt, not softened. Clara swallowed hard, hating how much sense it made. And you, she pressed, her eyes holding his. Why did you take the risk? Daniel leaned back in his chair, jaw tightening. Because it was my fight. I wear the badge, and it means something. If I let that pass, there's no law left here. And he paused, his gaze shifting toward the photograph by the bed because I've already buried one woman I loved. I wasn't about to watch another die in front of me while I stood still. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to ask about his wife, but she stopped herself. The sorrow in his voice told her enough, and pressing deeper felt like touching an open wound. Later, while Daniel cut outside, Clara sat near the hearth with needle and thread he had provided, trying to mend her dress. Her hands shook, not just from the fine work, but from thought of wearing it again. Every stitch reminded her of rough hands pulling at the fabric, of laughter from strangers who saw her not as human, but as entertainment. Still, she kept sewing. She told herself it was a small step toward reclaiming what she had lost. Daniel returned with an armful of wood, setting it by the door. He watched her for a moment without speaking, the fire light catching in her hair, the determination in her bent shoulders. He saw not weakness, but resilience, the kind that came quiet without boasting. When evening came, they shared supper at the table. Clara chewed slowly, her eyes avoiding his until finally she asked, "Will the town blame me?" She had heard whispers in other places. Women judged harsher than the men who wronged them. She feared the same fate would follow her here. Daniel didn't answer right away. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, then leaned forward, his voice low. "Some already do. They'll say what they want, but none of it changes the truth. You didn't do anything wrong." He let the words hang there, waiting until she looked at him, "and I won't let anyone put the blame on you." Clara felt something shift inside her chest. She still carried fear, but hearing it spoken so plainly, he wasn't blind to the town's cruelty, but he stood firm against it, gave her a thread of strength to hold on to. That night, when Daniel pulled the chair back to its place by the fire, Clara hesitated. She watched him set his revolver on the table, preparing to sit guard through the night as he had before. Her voice broke the silence. "You don't have to sit there all night. You need rest, too." He shook his head. "It's better this way. You'll sleep easier knowing someone's watching." Clara lowered her eyes, her hands twisting in the blanket. Part of her wanted to insist. Part of her wanted to ask him to stay closer, to sit beside her instead of across the room, but the words stuck in her throat. She wasn't ready, not yet. She lay back, listening to the steady rhythm of his breath, the sound of the fire popping, and for the first time since before her father's death, she drifted in his sleep without terror clawing at her chest. The next morning brought a harder edge to the air, clouds gathering low, as if the town's unease had crept into the weather itself. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and the scrape of a chair being pulled across the floor. Daniel was already at the table, polishing his revolver with the kind of care that spoke less of pride and more of discipline. She watched him quietly for a moment, wondering how a man so controlled, so silent, could also be the same one who had lifted her out of the dirt with such certainty. She dressed in a shirt he had given her again. Her own dress lay folded, still half mended. When she stepped into the room, he looked up briefly, then returned to his work. "You should eat," he said, nodding toward bread and beans he'd set out. The gesture was simple, but it told her more than words. He'd been awake long before her, making sure she had something warm in her stomach. As she ate, she found herself asking what she had avoided since arriving. "What will happen now? Do I stay here or do I leave once I can walk into town again?" The uncertainty knotted at her. She had no family, no money, no work waiting, and the whispers of the town's folk already painted her as a problem. Daniel set the revolver down, his eyes narrowing slightly as he considered. "You're not ready to go back into town. Not until you've got your strength back." And even then, he paused, measuring his words. "They won't make it easy on you." Clara's chest tightened. "So what then? I just stay here." There was both hope and fear in her voice because staying meant safety, but it also meant relying on a man she barely knew. "You stay," Daniel said firmly, no hesitation in his tone, at least for now. "What they think out there doesn't matter inside these walls." His conviction eased her, though she still felt the weight of the town's silence pressing from beyond the cabin. She glanced toward the window, remembering the way they had all stared as she begged for help. A thought struck her. "Do you think they'll blame you for bringing me here?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms crossing over his chest. "They already do. Some think I overstepped. Some think I've claimed you, but let them talk." His jaw flexed as his eyes hardened. "I've carried worse judgment in my life than whispers." Clara studied him, realizing how little she truly knew of the man beyond his badge and his loss. She asked softly, "What did you do before this? Before Dry Creek?" For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in that same low voice, he answered, "I fought. Union cavalry spent years seeing more blood than law. When I came back, there wasn't much left worth holding on to. The badge gave me something to do, gave me a reason not to drink myself into the ground." His tone was flat, but his eyes carried the truth of it. Too many memories that couldn't be buried. Clara's fork stilled on her plate. She felt a pull of empathy so strong it almost startled her. He had saved her, yes, but he was also carrying his own scars, and that knowledge drew her closer in ways she couldn't yet name. "I'm sorry," she whispered. though she wasn't sure if she meant for his past or for the fact that she was adding to his burdens now. Daniel shook his head once. Don't be. The day stretched into quiet work. Daniel chopped wood and checked the fences around his land while Clara remained inside, practicing her stitching on the torn dress until her fingers etched. Each stitch was crooked, but she pressed on, determined to make the garment whole again. She needed to believe she could mend something. If not herself, then at least the cloth that had been ripped apart. When he returned, sweat streaking his brow, she met him at the door with a basin of water. Here, she said, offering it. For the first time since she'd arrived, she touched his arm willingly, steadying him as he dipped his hands into the cool water. The contact startled them both. His muscles tensed under her fingers, but he didn't pull away. That night, the routine repeated. She lay on the bed. He took the chair. Yet, as she watched him from across the room, a new thought took root. He was not just guarding her out of duty. She could see it in the way his gaze flicked to her whenever she stirred, the way his hand never strayed far from the revolver. She realized he was carrying her safety as if it were his own. Before sleep pulled her under, Clara whispered into the dim room, her voice fragile, but sure. Thank you, Daniel. It wasn't about the bread or the shelter. It was about the choice he had made to stand when no one else did. Daniel didn't answer right away. He only shifted in his chair, his eyes fixed on a fire. Finally, in a voice so quiet she almost missed it, he said, "You don't owe me thanks." But his jaw softened, and for the first time in years, he felt the faint stir of something he thought he had buried with his wife, a reason to keep waking each morning beyond the weight of duty. The days fell into a rhythm, though neither Daniel nor Clara spoke of it as such. Morning meant coffee already set on the table when she woke, bread left for her to share, and Daniel's steady presence near the stove. Afternoons were split between his labor outside, cutting wood, checking the fences, tending the horse, and her quiet work inside. Mending clothes, sweeping the floor, or cooking what little they had. The silence between them was not the tense kind that weighed heavy, but the sort that left room to breathe. Yet beneath it was question neither dared voice. How long would this last? Clara felt herself changing in small ways. The trembling in her hands eased. Her shoulders no longer jumped at every creak in the walls. And though her dress was still torn and crude with stitches, she wore it again, standing taller than before. Still, she carried doubts. Would the town forever see her as the woman who knelt in the dirt, begging for a savior? Would Daniel tire of her presence once her fear faded? Each night when she lay in his bed with him, sitting guard across the room, she wondered what place she held in his life. Guest burden or something she couldn't yet name. That evening, while preparing supper, Clara found herself stealing glances at him more openly. He had removed his coat, his shirt clinging to his back from the day's labor, the scars on his forearm catching her eye. She thought of the war he had mentioned, of the weight he carried. For a moment, she felt a pull of guilt. He had saved her, but had she done anything for him? The imbalance knotted at her until she finally set the pot down and spoke. "Daniel, why do you still keep watch at night? You know I'm safe here." His gaze lifted from the revolver he was cleaning, his expression unreadable. "Because habits don't die easy, and because you sleep easier knowing I'm there." Her heart twisted at the bluntness. He wasn't guarding her because he thought she was weak. He was doing it because he knew what it meant to feel unprotected. She whispered almost more to herself. "It's not fair that you never rest." Daniel set the revolver aside, leaning back in his chair. "Fair doesn't matter. What matters is you waking in the morning without fear." Claire wanted to argue, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she turned to the fire, her thoughts pressing harder. She thought of her father, who had died, working a ranch that left her nothing but debts. She thought of weeks, drifting from town to town, begging for scraps, waiting for someone to offer kindness and finding none. She had told Daniel her name, but she realized she had never told him the rest. What had brought her so low she hesitated, then spoke. Before Dry Creek, I tried to find work, sewing, cleaning, anything. Men made offers, but not the kind I could accept. And when I said no, they bred words. By the time I reached this town, no one would give me a chance. Her voice cracked, shame burning her cheeks. That's why no one helped me. They already decided I wasn't worth it. Daniel's jaw tightened, his hands curling in fists on his knees. He had suspected something like it, but hearing her say it brought a weight into the room. He didn't interrupt, didn't soften it with false comfort. When she finished, he spoke with quiet conviction. They were wrong, you know that. Her eyes filled, but she nodded. Hearing it said aloud from him eased a knot that had lived in her chest for months. Later, after supper, Clara reached across the table as he stood to clear the dishes. Her hand touched his arm lightly, almost hesitant. You've done more for me than anyone else had. In years, her eyes searched his. But what about you? Who looks after you? The question caught him off guard. For years, he had lived without anyone daring to ask, and his first instinct was to dismiss it. But the way she held his arm, the quiet sincerity in her face pulled something from him he hadn't admitted aloud since his wife's death. No one, he said finally, not until now. The words hung between them, heavier than silence. Clara's hand lingered a moment longer before she pulled away, her cheeks flushed. Daniel returned to his chair by the fire that night, revolver in reach. But when she drifted to sleep, she felt closer to him than ever before. She no longer feared the dark in that cabin. She no longer feared waking alone. The following days blurred into a kind of uneasy peace. Clara no longer jumped at every sound outside the cabin, though she still flinched at sudden noises. Daniel noticed, but he didn't call attention to it. He only adjusted his movements, setting his boots down softer, closing doors without slam, making sure she never felt trapped by noise or shadow. It was a small thing, but it mattered, and she recognized it, even if he never spoke of it. That morning, Clara insisted on helping him stack the cut wood by the fence. She wore the mended dress for the first time, stitches crooked, but holding the neckline patched with fabric she had found in an old trunk. She felt exposed under the daylight, half expecting the weight of townsfolk eyes on her again, but here it was only Daniel, steady and watchful. He said nothing about her work, but when she stumbled with a heavy log, he was beside her in an instant, one hand gripping her elbow, steadying her. His touch lingered longer than necessary, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Inside, Clara's thoughts tangled. She remembered the way he had admitted no one. Not until now, when she asked who looked after him, the words clung to her. She wanted to know if he meant her presence in the cabin had already become something more than shelter. But she didn't dare ask directly. Instead, she tested the air. Daniel, do you ever think about leaving Dry Creek, about starting over somewhere else? He set the log down, wiped his hands on his trousers, and looked toward the horizon. I've thought about it, but every place is the same if you run from what's behind you. Better to stay where you've planted your boots. His answer carried the weight of experience. He wasn't a man who dreamed of new beginnings. He was a man who survived by enduring. Clara nodded slowly, her chest tightening. She thought of her own drifting, the months wasted, chasing new towns that never gave her a chance. She understood his words more than she wished, but one question still pressed. Would you have saved me if I hadn't said what I did in the street? Her voice shook with the risk of asking it. If I hadn't promised marriage, would you still have stepped forward? Daniel turned back to her, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, but in focus. I didn't move because of what you said. I moved because a man had a gun to a woman's head in broad daylight, and because he hesitated, searching for words he rarely used, because I couldn't live with myself if I stood still. Her shoulders loosened, relief flooding her. She had carried that fear since the moment he pulled the trigger, that he might see her words as a debt, a promise she owed him. Hearing him say otherwise untied a knot that had bound her since that day. By evening they shared supper again, but the silence between them felt different. Clara found herself watching the way he leaned back his chair, the way his jaw clenched when he thought, the steadiness in his hands even when he was tired. She realized she wasn't afraid of him, not in the way she had feared men before. The thought brought heat to her cheeks, and she busied herself with cleaning the table to hide it. That night, as Daniel prepared to sit in a chair again, Clara spoke before she lost her nerve. "You don't have to guard me like this every night." She paused, then added, "You could sit closer by the bed if you wanted." Her voice trembled not from fear, but from the uncertainty of what his answer would mean. Daniel studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he moved the chair, not all the way, but closer to the bed than before. He set his revolver on the table beside her instead of across the room. Clara lay back, her heart racing, not because she feared sleep, but because the line between them had shifted. She didn't know yet what it meant, only that for the first time she didn't feel alone in the dark. Daniel remained upright in the chair, his arms crossed, but his eyes softened as they rested on her. He thought of his late wife, of the years since, and he knew this closeness was different. It wasn't replacing what he had lost. It was something new, unplanned, fragile, but real. He stayed quiet, but inside he admitted to himself what he hadn't in years. He wanted to keep this woman safe, not just because of duty, but because she mattered to him now. Clara drifted into sleep, with the faint sound of his breathing steady beside her, and for once her dreams were free of the outlaw's shadow. The change was small, almost unnoticeable to anyone but them, yet it carried weight. Daniel's chair had been moved closer to the bed, and though he still sat upright through the night, Clara could feel the nearness of him. When she woke in the dark, panicked by some half-formed dream, she no longer had to strain to see him. His silhouette was right there, steady and watchful, the faint glint of his revolver catching the firelight. That closeness was enough to let her fall back to sleep. In the morning, Clara found herself watching him more openly. She noticed the way he rolled his sleeves past his forearms before splitting wood, the way his scarred hands moved with careful precision as he cleaned his weapons. She noticed, too, the lines of weariness at the corners of his eyes, marks of years spent carrying burdens alone. The question returned, who looked after him? She had asked once, but she could see the answer every day. No one, and she wondered if she had the strength to change that. That afternoon, Daniel returned from town with a small sack of supplies. Clara's chest tightened at the sight. She had feared he might face hostility for sheltering her. Did they say anything? She asked, her voice betraying the worry she had tried to hide. He set the sack down on the table. They looked, they whispered, same as before. He met her eyes, his tone steady, but no one tried to stop me. Her relief was real, but so was the sting. "So I'll always be the woman they talk about," she murmured. It wasn't a question. Daniel's jaw tightened, his voice firm. "You'll be the woman I protected, that's what matters." The certainty in his tone silenced her doubts for the moment, but deep inside, she still wondered, would he ever see her as more than a responsibility, more than a woman he had carried out of danger? That night, the fire burned low. The room hushed except for the soft crackle of wood. Clara lay under the blanket, eyes half up, watching Daniel as he sat near. Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Daniel, you don't have to sit in that chair anymore. There's room here if you wanted." She expected him to refuse, but the words escaped her anyway, born of something deeper than fear, something closer to longing. Daniel didn't answer right away. He studied her face, the flicker of fire light across her skin, the mixture of vulnerability and courage in her eyes. He thought of the promises he had made to himself after his wife's death, that he would never open himself again, that his life would be duty alone. But Clara's presence had chipped away at that wall piece by piece until the silence between them no longer felt like armor but like distance. Slowly he moved. He set the revolver on the table, untied his boots, and lowered himself to sit at the edge of the bed. Clara's breath caught, her heart racing with both fear and hope. He didn't lie beside her, not yet, but the weight of him on the mattress changed everything. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Clara reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed his hand. He didn't pull away. His hand closed over hers, rough and calloused, steady and warm. She whispered, her voice breaking, "I don't want to feel alone anymore." Daniel turned his hand, clasping hers fully. His voice was low, heavy with restraint, but also with truth. "You're not." Her eyes filled, and she leaned toward him, her lips brushing his in the faintest kiss. Uncertain, fragile, but real. He hesitated only a moment before his hand moved to her back, holding her gently as he returned the kiss. It was not a kiss of desperation, but of choice, the kind that told her she was no longer just someone he had saved. She was someone he had chosen to stay with. When they finally parted, Clara rested her forehead against his chest, her breath unsteady. Daniel's arms stayed firm around her, his silence saying what he could not yet put into words. For the first time, she believed what her heart had feared to hope. He wasn't just protecting her because of duty. He wanted her here with him, and though the night stretched quiet, the cabin no longer felt like a place of mourning. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them had expected, but both now held on to. The days after that night passed with a different weight. The silence between Clara and Daniel was no longer a wall, but a bridge. He no longer kept to the chair once darkness fell. He stayed by her side, at first sitting stiff at the edge of the bed, later lying beside her, his arms steady around her waist, as if he had always belonged there. What had begun as protection now felt like choice, and Clara felt it with every small gesture. The way he left an extra cup of coffee waiting for her, the way his hand brushed her shoulder when he passed, the way he looked at her without judgment when she wore her patch dress in town. The whispers in Dry Creek did not vanish, but they changed. Men who once sneered now kept their distance, knowing Daniel's name meant finality. Women who had looked away in shame began to soften, some even nodding at Clara when she passed. It was slow, but the weight of gossip that had nearly crushed her began to lift, not because the town forgave her, but because Daniel had made it clear. She was not a woman left to fend for herself anymore. Clara herself carried questions she hadn't yet spoken. Would he ever want more than this fragile closeness? Did he still carry guilt for letting her into a life that had once belonged to his wife? The photograph by the bed remained a quiet presence. One evening, as they sat near the fire, she asked softly, "Do you still think of her?" Daniel looked at the picture for a long time before answering. "Every day," he admitted, then his eyes shifted back to Clara. "But thinking of her doesn't take away what I feel here with you." It was the first time he had said it plainly. The truth steadied her more than denial ever could have. Weeks turned into the first stretch of spring. Clara no longer felt like a guest in the cabin. She cooked without asking, washed his shirts by the creek, and even rode into town by his side. The fear that had once clawed at her chest when she stepped on a Dry Creek street had dulled. She still saw the eyes on her, but now she saw Daniel there, too, broad-shouldered, quiet, hat tipped low, his presence making every stare scatter. One Sunday, as they stood outside the small church at the edge of town, Clara heard a woman murmur behind her, "There she is, the one the sheriff carried out." Clara's chest tightened, but before she could look down, Daniel took her hand openly, lacing his fingers with hers. He didn't look at the townsfolk. He looked only at Clara, his voice steady. "You ready?" She nodded, tears pricking her eyes, not from shame, but from the sudden certainty that he meant forever. That evening, back at the cabin, Daniel set aside his gun belt and took her hands across the table. His voice was quiet but firm, as if every word carried more weight than he'd ever allowed himself to speak. "Clara, you once said you'd marry anyone who saved you. I never wanted that to bind you to me, but now I'm asking you because I want you, not out of duty, not because of what happened in that street, because I choose you." Clara's breath caught. all the nights of fear, all the questions of whether she was just a burden, all the doubts of whether he saw her as anything more, they fell away. She pressed his hands tighter and whispered, "I'm not marrying you because you saved me, Daniel. I'm marrying you because you stayed." He stood, pulling her gently into his arms, and kissed her with a certainty that left no room for doubt. It was not hurried or desperate, but solid. A vow sealed without paper or priest. In that moment, Clara Hayes, once a woman broken and shamed, became Clara Kay by choice and by love. The days that followed carried the rhythm of something whole. Clara tended the hearth, and the garden Daniel had long neglected, laughter returning to her voice in small bursts that surprised them both. Daniel rose each morning with a new steadiness. The weight of loneliness finally lifted. The town still whispered, but the sheriff and his wife no longer cared. By the time spring was in full bloom, Clara stood on the porch of the cabin, her patched dress replaced with one Daniel had bought for her in town, her hand resting on her belly where new life had quietly begun. Daniel stepped behind her, his arms circling her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. They looked out across the land, rough, unforgiving, but theirs. The woman who once knelt in the dirt, begging for anyone to save her, now stood tall beside the man who had not only saved her, but stayed, and together they carried a future no one in Dry Creek could ever take away.